my screen, and I want to use this as a short introduction to Corbin's life for people who may not be familiar with it, because I don't want to take up the time in our upcoming class. He was born in 1903 in Paris and died in 1978, also in Paris. And he was raised by his aunt because his mother died when he was extremely young. This is his aunt, and the young Henri, about 5 years old, was not unusual at the time for young men to be dressed this way. It may have been slightly unusual, the degree to which Corbin was effeminized by his aunt, but not as strikingly so as it might seem to us. At the time, they didn't distinguish genders as early as we did. Nonetheless, it does seem to me that it can't have but had an effect on the young man. We don't have a biography of Corbin, which is too bad because people who knew him are dying. If we jump 20 years or so, here's the young Henri having completed education at the seminary school and attending the Sorbonne with an interest in philosophy and theology. Here is the Sorbonne, approximately the time that Corbin would have attended. He was the student of a variety of stellar theologians and philosophers, among them Etienne Gilson, who's a noted Thomist, and who was himself engaged at the time in a study of the influence of Islamic thought on early and medieval Christianity, which had, needless to say, a lot of interest for Corbin. In 1929, Corbin met Louis Massignon, who is a study in himself, was a Catholic, a priest, I'm pretty sure, and a passionate defender of the rights of the Algerians during the French occupation, and who himself spent many years in North Africa among the locals, and wrote a masterpiece, 4 volumes on the life of the martyr and heretic Al-Hallaj. And Massignon spent some time at the Eranos lectures conference, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Corbin took courses from him, said he was amazing as a professor, and Massignon noted in the young Corbin considerable promise. In the year that Corbin worked at the Oriental Collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale, Massignon brought him a mimeographed copy of some 500 pages, as Corbin says, of Chouravardis philosophy of illumination. And Chouravardis became essentially Corbin's spiritual master throughout the course of his life, he would say later on. In the same year, 1929, Martin Heidegger published Being in Time. Corbin's copy of Being in Time was annotated and glossed in Arabic, because Corbin was reading Chouravardis in Arabic, medieval Arabic, and reading Heidegger in the original German and seeing strong connections between the two. Both of them were engaged, he thought, in hermeneutics. It's quite explicit in Heidegger. Heidegger comes from a tradition of medieval theology. He wrote his master's degree on Duns Scotus, and was profoundly familiar with the tradition of hermeneutics, which is interpretation of biblical texts in the Western tradition. The kind of interpretation of texts that Corbin found in Shuravarti is called tahwil. And there will be much to be said about that as we go on. Heidegger said many years later, what I searched for in Heidegger and what I understood thanks to Heidegger is the same thing that I searched for and found in Iranian Islamic metaphysics. But with this, everything was situated at a different level. Heidegger is notoriously secular in being and time. That aspect of his work held no interest for Corbin. But they were both involved in a similar kind of attempt to rectify what they saw as errors, mistakes, wrong turns in Western history. But whereas Heidegger went to the pre-Socratics, Corbin went to Islam and the East, a world where the history of being is something entirely other than that imposed by the transition from Greek to Latin. And it was in the world of the Iranian mystics that he found what he was looking for, which he called the mundus imaginalis. And he said, for a long period, I have been searching like a young philosopher for the key to this world as a real world, which is neither the sensible world nor the world of abstract concepts. It was in Iran itself that I had to find it, in the two ages of the spiritual world of Iran. There's obviously an enormous amount to be said about the relationship that Corbin saw between Heidegger and Iranian spirituality. But suffice it to say now that spiritual hermeneutics is the connecting link in Corbin's view. He was extremely peripatetic during this time, and he knew virtually everyone of importance, and he traveled to Germany to meet with Heidegger on 3 occasions, I think, because he was, in fact, the first Frenchman to translate anything by Heidegger. He later soon recognized the inadequacy of his translations, and he sort of tried to expunge them from his formal bibliography. Nonetheless, it's an important turning point in French intellectual history, because it was via Corbin's translations that the French had their first access to Heidegger's very difficult German text. It's of no small importance that Corbin was also influenced by Berdyaev, the Russian philosopher, and was in fact the president of the French Berdyaev Society for quite some years, I think. I knew nothing about this until my young colleague Hadi Fakouri, who's currently at McGill, did his master's thesis on Corbin and Berdyaev, which is a wonderful piece of work, which is available online if you try to get it. And that speaks volumes, because Corbin was pretty well familiar with the Russian and Russian Orthodox intellectual tradition, at least in part because of the presence of a lot of Russian emigres to Paris after the Russian Revolution. Among them, a number of theologians and philosophers on whose work Corbin drew fairly deeply, because he felt that Eastern Orthodox Christianity, either Russian or Greek, had a connection to the mystical tradition that had been lost by most of the Western church. And it's a very important part of his of his body of work, of Corbin's body of work, to recognize that connection. We may have a chance to talk about it at some point, because Corbin really was a mystic. On one of his trips, this is still early, 1932, one of the trip he took to Sweden to visit a couple of Swedish philosophers and theologians, he left us a record of a meditation that he had while sitting on the shores of Lake Siljan in southern Sweden. As I recall, it's to the northwest of Stockholm. I looked it up once, and here's a picture of the lake. And he called it Theology by the Lakeside, Theology au bord du lac. And it's not a short meditation. I mean, it's not a long meditation, but it's not quite as short as this. And this is my translation, for what it's worth, of a couple of paragraphs from a two-page meditation. He wrote, and this speaks volumes about Corbin's approach to reality. It will soon be dusk, but for now the clouds are still clear. The pines are not yet darkened, for the lake brightens them into transparency. And everything is green, with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in recital. It must be heard seated very close to the earth, arms crossed, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. For it is not necessary to strut about like a conqueror and want to give a name to things, to everything. It is they who will tell you who they are if you listen, yielding like a lover. For suddenly for you, in the untroubled peace of this forest of the north, the earth has come to thou, visible as an angel that would perhaps be a woman. And in this apparition, this greatly green and thronging solitude, the angel too is robed in green, the green of dusk, of silence, and of truth. Then there is in you all the sweetness that is present in the surrender to an embrace that triumphs over you. At each moment where you read in truth, as now, what is there before you, where you hear the angel and the earth and woman, then you receive everything, everything in your absolute poverty. You are the poor one, you are man, and he is God, and you cannot know God, or the earth, or the angel, or woman. You must be encountered, taken, known, that they may speak. Otherwise, you're alone. There's an awful lot to be commented on in this piece. From the beginning, where we have an instance of a kind of mystical synesthesia, where green is a sound. Corbin was an accomplished organist and keyboardist, and musical metaphors abound in his work. And here's a place where it's particularly important. And another thing to notice is what he calls elsewhere mystical poverty, which is required. A profound ontological humility. You have to be quiet and stand back and recede so that the beings around you will speak. And if you're lucky, the angel of the earth may appear, and she may perhaps be a woman. One of the other things to point out here is the gendered nature of the angel of the earth. Like Jung, Corbin felt that Western civilization was excessively masculinist and that the feminine aspects of reality required emphasis. He's not a feminist in the modern sense. Nonetheless, he was a champion of a certain, at least binary, gendered, balanced view of the world before it became widely regarded as essential. There's a remarkable person. In a letter of 1932, a friend wrote this about Corbin to a third person. This Corbin is quite the most erudite man I've ever met. He is baffling. He knows French, German, Italian, Spanish, English, Arabic, and Persian, and enough to read Sanskrit, Turkish, Dutch, Swedish, and Latin. He's immersed in Arabic mysticism and is familiar with every turn of contemporary German philosophy and theology, all the representatives of which he knows personally. But above all knowledge is for him directly linked to his immediate existential task. He hates history when it's other than a presentation of things and men, and he revolts vehemently against so many psychological, cautious, and unreal French methods. Simply said, he's a Christian. He is quite a rare and benevolent French type. And it's worth mentioning that later on he learned to read Syriac, Aramaic, and Russian. So he was a sort of polyglot linguist that I can't help but be incredibly impressed by. In 1933, he married Stella Lienhardt, who was to remain his guardian and companion until the end of his days. She died many years after he did. They never had children. And here's lovely pictures from the collection of Les Amis d'Henri Stella Corbin in Paris. Their website is admirably maintained, amicorbin.com. There's a lot of great pictures there, as well as a number of other things, all of which are worth your attention. And not all in French, by the way. I don't know who the third woman is. Corbin and Stella. And I don't know who the third is. Looks as if perhaps it might have been Stella's sister, but I don't know that. In 1940, they went to Istanbul, and they were to remain there for the duration of the Second World War. They went before the outbreak of the war, I believe. And Corbin was the only member of the French Institute of Archaeology while they were there. And he spent his time in the library translating Chauvardi and collecting and collating and copying manuscripts, which had all of which had remained untouched on shelves for centuries, perhaps. So the whole duration of the war, Corbin spent studying Chauvardi and others. And here's a picture that I just love to show. Corbin with a cigarette dangling from his lips, churning out tunes on the organ. And I suspect that he isn't, but I like to think that he's playing ragtime, more likely Bach or Mozart. And here he is again. All the pictures are undated, and so I can't really tell you when these were taken, but they're all in his midlife, clearly. Here's a great picture of Stella and Henri and friends. I don't know who any of the other people are. When the war was over, they went to Teheran, which was their first visit there. Corbin was to get a position as professor of philosophy at the university in Tehran, which he maintained until the end of his life in '78. They went back to Paris after their visit in Tehran. And Corbin was soon to become a professor at the Sorbonne, and he was shortly to take over Massignon's position as head of the section of religions of Arabia, as they called it in those days. In 1949, he was invited to attend the Eranos conferences in Switzerland, where, as many of you will know, C.G. Jung held court for decades. And the group of people who were invited over the years to Eranos is a who's who of thinkers whose interests in religion and mythology and the humanities and psychology and indeed the sciences is well known. Corbin presented there almost every year from 1949 until 1978 when he died. He was one of the major figures at the conferences. And most of his lectures have been published in one or another of his books. Many of the most important of which have been translated, though by no means all. Here he is in old age. He was nearly deaf for many years and wore hearing aids, which Robbie Bosnack says he used to turn off when he wanted to absent himself from the surrounding hubbub. If any of you know where this photo was taken, I'd be happy to know. One of these days I'll see if I can figure it out on the basis of the architecture depicted. Corbin's desk at Rue Odéon in Paris, where they lived for many years. And here he is talking to Jung. All these are undated. The relationship between Jung and Corbin, in both personal and intellectual, is extremely interesting, and we might have a chance to talk about it later on. I've written about it here and there in some of the books. Their approaches share a great deal in common, but they are quite distinct, Corbin being a theologian and mystic, and Jung always, for all his mysticism and all his brilliance, I don't mean to say that because I don't mean to be critical here, but Jung's scientific side was often in some conflict with his more spiritual, religious, and mystical side, and therefore it makes some of his work. It produces a tension in some of his work. That kind of tension never occurs for Corbin because he's totally uninterested in being seen as a scientist. He's a mystical theologian and philosopher, and there may be tensions in his work for other reasons, but that isn't one of them. Here's Henri and Stella with Denise de Rougemont, who was a longtime friend of Corbin, and whose book, Love in the Western World, is well worth your reading. He was a bit critical, not in that book as I recall, but there are some anecdotes here and there that suggest he was a bit critical of Corbin's gendered discussion of the femininity of the angels, and he was a little concerned that Corbin hadn't sufficiently appreciated the distinctions between male and female human psyches. At least I think that's what was in de Rougemont's mind. De Rougemont's very, very interesting writer. And here is obviously this must have been taken in the mid 70s, not long before Corbin died. A picture of Corbin and the great Jewish scholar Gershom Scholem, and Robert Bosnak, a young Robert Bosnak, sitting between the two of them. And what a catbird seat to be in. Bosnak has written that for reasons that he never understood, Corbin seemed to take a liking to him and used to talk to him and share thoughts with him, which is something to be hoped for. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And yet another picture showing Corbin in an unguarded moment at Eranos, which I'm quite fond of. and here he and Stella are with Adolf Portman, who was a biologist and for years was administrative head of the Eranos conferences, and whose work was pretty important in Hillman's later work. And here is James Hillman with Gilbert Durand and Henri Corbin in 1966. The other people in the photo I do not know, though people may well recognize them. Because, of course, Hillman knew Corbin fairly well from the Eranos conferences, because he went there for many years. Sorry. Here's a rare picture of Corbin lecturing at Eranos. The first time I ever heard of Corbin was reading this paragraph in Hillman's Thought of the Heart, which was his Eranos lecture from the early 80s sometime. I'd been reading Hillman for a couple of years with joy and pleasure and astonishment. And when I read this, it turned me towards Corbin, because listen to what Hillman says about him. You who have been privileged at some time during his long life to have attended a lecture by Henri Corbin have been present at a manifestation of the thought of the heart. You have been witness to its creative imagination, its theophanic power of bringing the divine face into visibility. You will also know in your hearts that the communication of the thought of the heart proceeds in that fashion of which he was master, as a recital, an account of the imaginal life as a journey among imaginal essences, an account of the essential. In him, imagination was utterly presence. One was in the presence of imagination itself. That imagination in which and by which the spirit moves from the heart towards all origination. And when I read that, I thought, who? Henri Corbin? Who is this person? And that was 30 years ago. Here's a fascinating anecdote from the upcoming second volume of Russell's biography of Hillman. He sent me a copy of the chapter on the Eranos lectures and Hillman to have me check it out. And this anecdote told by David Miller came as quite a surprise to me, because my My image of Corbin was as a much more gentle and passive figure than he comes across in this anecdote. David Miller generally joined the French-speaking table. Immediately following Miller's Eranos lecture on polytheism, where he spoke on the importance of many gods and differences, none other than Corbin glared across the table and asked, "But Monsieur Miller, what is beyond the many? What is the one beyond the many?" Miller said he didn't know. Twice more, and ultimately red in the face and at the top of his voice, Corbin asked the same question. Both times, Miller gave the same answer, curiously, finding himself completely at ease, as he said finally, in a quiet voice, "I don't know." Corbin leaned over, grabbed the younger man around the neck, and said, "Tu es mon frère." You are my brother. Later, Corbin told him, "The first time you answered, it was unconscious. You didn't know what you were saying. The second time you answered, you were too conscious. It was calculated. The third time you answered, it was from the heart. And that is where we have to get." I mean, imagine the young David Miller being invited to the grand lectures at Eranos, being accosted by one of the great figures there. What an astonishing story this is. The third time you answered, it was from the heart. And that is where we have to get. A remarkable, passionate, brilliant, iconoclastic, and apparently difficult, which should come as no surprise, human being. I wish I knew more about him. I would dearly wish we had a biography. On the 26th of September, the doctor authorized the return to Rue Odeon. Henri, overjoyed, barely slept, planned to finish his works, and then, troubled, asked the doctor, "Do you think I can finish this book?" "Oh, I know you. Even if you had 100 years ahead of you, you'd ask me the same question. You'd have another urgent book to finish, and more besides." "That may well be," Corbin replied. "The thing is, you see, with my books, I'm struggling against the same thing as you, each in our own way. You as a doctor, and I as historian of religions, are engaged in the same struggle. We're leading a campaign against death." He was buried in a cemetery in Montmorency, not too far north of Paris. And the epitaph that he chose is from his review of Jung's answer to Job. "Un monde où la mort devrait précéder toute connaissance, où le sens de la mort ne serait que la nostalgie de la résurrection. A world where love would precede all knowledge, where the meaning of death would be only nostalgia for resurrection." And Stella was buried alongside of him in 2003.